Hello and welcome to this episode of Concurrence Antitrust Code podcast. Today we're going to be talking to Marshall van Alstyne, Questrom Professor at Boston University. The title of today's topic is Good Ideas and Bad Ideas for Regulation. Thank you very much, Marshall, for being here. Now, it's often said that a good law can really improve things, but a bad law can really make things a lot worse. Where do you stand on deciding when it's right to regulate and when we should maybe be a little bit slower in bringing in regulation?
So I think it's a wonderful set of questions. I think there's some good laws and bad laws, and I've seen both of them on the books. Let me preface my remarks up front. I'm actually not taking money from either side, so I'd like to present my views as an academic neutral on some of these issues. So I do think that we're seeing an awful lot of responses to legitimate grievances. So up front, I do see, for example, that Amazon using data to enter its partners' markets, that's a challenge. Or Google bidding against its partners when it has privileged assets. Again, that is a legitimate challenge. I do think there are grievances that we need to pay attention to. But at its core, I think one of the key differences is that the prior antitrust laws were designed for an earlier era of rival assets, of tangible goods. So if you look at railroads, or if you look at energy or oil in the traditional antitrust context, if you're using a railroad car or a track, or you're burning a barrel of oil, or you're consuming a watt of energy, someone else cannot. So often we'll try to create competition by dividing up those assets and putting them against one another. In the internet era, it's different. Here we're talking about data, we're talking about information. It's a non-rival asset. You and I can both have it. And so carving it up often actually is not necessarily a good idea. The express goal of the current legislation and things such as the Digital Markets Act is to create contestable markets, to create competition. If the implication is that we are then dividing those assets, we're then splitting up firms, then we're losing much of the value that we might get from network effects, much of the value that we're getting from data. So I think we need to ask the question differently. The question we should be asking is, how do we create value? And then how do we foster the innovation and divide that value so that consumers get a greater share of it, or the ecosystem partners get a greater share of it? So I think we need to reposition the laws relative to where they're currently headed.
Well, one of the big laws on that here in Europe is the Digital Markets Act, which is currently being thrashed out. We're maybe going to see it coming into force at the beginning of 2023, but we still don't know what it will look like. So I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on questions around using data for market adjacent services. We've got these so-called core services that companies may have, but then, leveraging that data for these adjacent services.
Oh, wonderful question. So using data to leverage entry into different markets and also create value in other areas overall is a wonderful thing. To give you an example, in the United States, Amazon, of course, is an interesting electronic commerce company or in cloud services company. But they're also starting to leverage their data to enter healthcare, and the margins in that are enormous and extremely expensive. So Amazon's entry into healthcare is likely to bring about far better services and prices and lower margins. So that's actually, in effect, a good thing overall. Let's back up a moment and consider what's happening in the Digital Markets Act. There's some things that are really well done. So I think there are several tenets of the act that are really cleverly designed. So one of them is limiting most favored nation clauses. So it says the platform has to get the best terms of anybody, otherwise you can't use the platform. So limiting that is a good idea. Another one is ad response transparency. When you run ads on there, you can't get responsiveness of your own advertisements, or merchants are being disintermediated from their own data. That's just not fair. Those are legitimate grievances, or we have to allow for interoperability. Again, all excellent ideas. But let's take some of the things where I think the legislation is off the rails. So one of them is that you can't use data to enter your partner's markets. We actually, in any other context, welcome market entry. So you're getting better prices, you're getting better competition. Here, it's the unfairness. So what we should do is allow others to enter under the same terms. So perhaps it's better that with a delay, other competing companies would gain access to market level data and allow them to enter, so that it's not just the market maker that's entering, but lots of different parties would gain access to the same data in order that they too could create consumer value and enter and give us new kinds of innovation. Separately, we actually see a bit of that in Payment Services Directive 2 in open banking. Banks are now required to open APIs to let third parties in to conduct transactions. And we're seeing new fintechs arise. It's that kind of innovation that we'd like to foster. So rather than forbidding use of that data to enter, we want to make it available for others so that they too can enter. I'll give you another example. Data portability is being used as a way to create privacy and to perhaps create competition. Data portability is one of the main mechanisms that's been provided in GDPR, General Data Privacy Regulation. It's also been emphasized in the Digital Markets Act. This has a huge variety of problems. The first is that when you take data away from the marketplace, it loses context. There was a great set of research that was done by the folks at Programmable Web trying to take data out of Facebook. You can get your own data, but you can't get the posts of other people around it. That's their data, so you lose the context. Another is that it stagnates, so you lose access to the recent data. Another element is you get a problem with impotence. Once the data is removed from its platform, you can't use it to make a post, to make a purchase, or to receive a benefit. So you can't use it or act upon it in some way. And the last one is a phenomenon that the regulators just hadn't anticipated. So for example, you get moral hazard. The idea behind the legitimate idea is to create more competition where merchants could pull their data off of someplace like Amazon and take their ratings with them to foster competition. What's this do? Well, merchants gain control of their data and they drop their low ratings, and all of a sudden everyone looks like a 5-star, and it increases the risk to consumers. So you've introduced moral hazard when you do that. We actually think that there's a better way to do this, taking advantage of the properties of data to increase value. So we're proposing a new data right as a new way to actually solve this problem. So here's how this might work. Users would gain the right to allow third parties to access their data and create value on their behalf. What does this do? Well, the first is it creates and preserves all of the context. So Amazon could come in and make recommendations for books on your Facebook data, or Facebook could make recommendations for friends based on your reading, as an example. It is completely fresh because it's getting currently, you actually have the recent data, so you don't have to refresh it. Another is its potency. Because you're still using it in its location, you can use it to make a purchase or make a post or receive a benefit from someone else. And it also solves the moral hazard problem. Merchants can't simply delete their 1- and 2-star reviews and upload them in a new location. There's one last component of this that I really like, which is it enables regulators to actually do monitoring of the platforms themselves. Consider what happens when, there's actually, let me back up. There was a wonderful study, it was done, one in Germany and one in New York University, where users had granted permission for these researchers to access their Facebook accounts and see what misinformation, what ads they're being displayed. Facebook turned off those APIs. They didn't want the scrutiny. They claimed that was providing the private data of advertisers. Despite a scolding from the Federal Trade Commission, they continued in that particular practice. If we grant users an in situ data right, that means you can grant permission to allow analysis of the data that you're seeing so you can get better informed on what you're seeing. We think this is a new way of designing this regulation in a way that third parties can create value on top of the data, just like the original firm, and create further access. So we think there are better ways of designing the legislation to capture the benefits of the data and address the problems that we see in the background.
Well, you made reference to their behavioral advertising or data-driven advertising. There is a bit of talk, or at least a bit of speculation in the EU, that maybe that is a sector that requires its own separate sectoral regulation. Do you have an opinion on that? Because it is a sort of a unique issue that brings together so many elements of other things, like you mentioned, privacy, GDPR, or services and platform regulation. Do you think that a single sectoral ad-driven regulation might be the way forward?
I have mixed feelings about that. In particular, I worry a little bit that we wind up designing legislation that's specific to a point in time. And as technology evolves and business models evolve, they don't really address the fundamental issues. By analogy, I like to describe it as adding epicycles to a geocentric universe, as opposed to looking for a deeper theory and finding a heliocentric universe that suddenly explains everything much better. So personally, I prefer to try to look for the deeper principles from which you can actually design better business models or better regulatory interventions, or shall we say transparency. To give you an example, a mechanism might be allowing sufficient transparency and interoperability that competitors can keep an eye on each other without having the regulators forcing them to go open and crack open the systems and develop expertise on their own. The competition among the firms will naturally lead them to reveal the problems from which they can then themselves appeal, rather than having the regulators do that work. So in general, I favor the deeper solutions that try to address the more fundamental problems rather than ad hoc legislation that's just in the moment, and see if we can find something for the long term.
Well, again, picking up on this question of interoperability, transparency, another big driving force that we're seeing here coming out of the European Commission is this idea of trying to leverage industrial data. I think the EU very much feels it's missed the boat on a lot of these customer-facing social network type services. And now there's an effort to try and maybe get Industry 4.0, this manufacturing data, but also open data, and make it more interoperable. Do you see any resistance to that? What's your feeling on that? Do you think that it's going to actually work as is envisaged? If yes, why? And if not, why not?
There seems to be huge opportunity here. And particularly as you get to machine data, or you get the Internet of Things, it may be less concerning on privacy if what you're looking at is the temperature settings or light switches among machines. So you don't have as much just personally descriptive data. So I think there's more opportunity here. I also do think that we're going to see more of the platforms moving into the B2B space, when previously we've seen it in the B2C space. And firms are in much better position to bargain amongst themselves in the B2B level than they are in the B2C level, where the platform is far more powerful than any individual. I think there's enormous opportunity here. I do expect to see more growth, and I do think that proper legislation can facilitate that growth. Again, I think the question must be, how is it that you can create the ecosystems for joint use of that data, for interoperable access to that data, and for competitive transparency, for gaining fair and equal access to that data. So those, I think, are the opportunities, and I do think they're immense, both in Europe and even in the East, even in China as well.
Well, I know I didn't want to focus too much on enforcement per se, but I do want to ask a little bit about the question of, if you like, enforcement across countries, across transatlantic. So many of these big actors that we've seen are in the US. Europe is here trying to create these markets acts and these new sort of competition rules, as well as consumer rules and privacy rules. Is there a way in which there's a push and a pull here? I also thinking of things like class action suits or that sort of, which strays even into consumer law. Is there a tension between all this different regulation in terms of how you go about making it work together and implementing it?
So it's quite interesting. I do believe that there are tensions coming from multiple sides. And by here, I really do mean multiple sides. So in Europe, where there are fewer native platforms, the tension seems to be becoming more from the consumers and from the businesses that are affected by platforms themselves. In the United States, I think we're seeing more resistance from the platforms. They have a little bit more power, more lobbying, and they are native to the United States. So I think they're getting more influence. And then contrast that with China, where you get a different actor. The state government is now quite active in regulating those platforms in ways that are even more aggressive than in Europe. And they have then used them as mechanisms for increasing visibility of the government into the lives of the citizens. That's a quite interesting set of trade-offs. So you're getting different perspectives from different continents, if you will. And I do think we're going to see different balances and different experiments. I think the Americans in some ways are a little late to the party in platform regulation. I do think there's perhaps a bit of nativist perceptions in Europe about trying to protect the consumers relative to the platforms and foster some platforms, legitimate concerns there. But I think in some cases, again, frictions have been added in ways that may harm the ecosystems. As mentioned, GDPR reduced venture capital investment. It reduced ad effectiveness. It actually reduced the number of apps available to different parties. At the same time, in the United States, there's too much invasion of privacy. We have Cambridge Analytica. There is not sufficient regulation. There's too much fake news. There are disasters lurking in electoral problems, and those also need to be addressed. So where are the pressures coming from? I think we're seeing different pressures from different continents, and we're going to need to come, as I would say earlier, to some deeper principles to regulate platforms in the right way.
Well, a final question then, and you can wrap up and add in any thoughts or anything you think we've missed. With this Digital Markets Act, the EU is trying to lead the way globally. It feels it could have the same ripple effects as the GDPR, which was indeed used as a template for privacy laws around the world, and even the California law. Do you see that the EU might be a place where the focus is on the regulation, whereas in other parts of the world, the focus is on, well, to use Mark Zuckerberg's words, move fast and break things?
Well, he's certainly been moving fast and breaking things. There's a time when it's actually worthy to regulate. And indeed, Zuckerberg himself has said it's time to get some guidance from governments on different kinds of regulation, in particular such things as fake news. I think the Europeans are leading the way in this. As one example, one of my favorite illustrations really is the open banking legislation that we're seeing coming out of Brussels and separately out of the UK. In that instance, it has been a case where creating opportunity for third parties to come in and access the platform infrastructure and to access the data has allowed third parties to create value, which is exactly what I was talking about in the beginning, but trying to find new ways to create value, not simply try to create new competition. Data is a non-rival resource. We can all do is to have it under the right terms. Even a transaction that's a credit card, well, the merchant has it and the consumer has it because it's a two-party investment. And so we need to allow both parties to make the best use of it. And we also need to find ways to reduce the market power of the center of the platforms in order that more of that value is shared back. Again, I think Europeans are leading in that. I think we can learn from the positive examples as well as the negative examples, from open banking as well as GDPR.